Hey, everyone. Welcome to our first Substack conversation for Breaking the News, our new deep dive podcast series in development that takes a historical look as well as a today look at CNN and the rise of what we're calling the birth of chaos media. I'm joined today by Bill Smee, like me, a CNN veteran and co-producer of the series. Bill, great to have you here. You're coming in from Washington, I think.
I am, and glad to be here, John. Thanks.
And for our first conversation, Bill and I talked about a lot of people, some of whom we've already talked to about the series. And we landed on Lisa Napoli, who joins us today. Hi, Lisa.
Hi there.
Lisa, as many of you probably know, is the author of a series of books, a bunch of books, actually, and one of which is Up All Night, CNN, Ted Turner, CNN, and the Birth of 24-Hour News. We'll talk a lot about that book among the CNN alum group, the large global network. This is one of our favorite reads the last few years. Lisa, thanks for all that hard work. You're also the author of a couple other books, including one about NPR. Both of these topics are super in the news, right, Paul? And that's what we're going to dig into. But before we go back, Lisa, to the CNN's beginnings, let's go to today. What do you think about what's going on?
Well, what's going on is really not surprising. The consolidation that's happening today is exactly what happens over the course of all media and all industry over time. It's happened in the internet industry. It happened in the hamburger industry. I wrote about the creation of McDonald's in an earlier book. So it doesn't surprise me one bit that companies are gobbling each other up.
Yeah. And kind of quick follow-up before we get Bill in here. Tragedy, not a tragedy. This is business. This is the way capitalism works. What's your take?
This is business. This is the way capitalism works. We'll talk back in history, which is where I'm more prepared to talk and where I'm more comfortable talking, because if you look at the history, you aren't surprised by what's going on today in any sense of the word. Politically, socially, the dumbing down of America is something that everybody's been worried about for decades. It just has snowballed and accelerated because of the way the media have developed. So none of it surprises me one bit. And yes, it is the way capitalism is.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned history, because I do think we want to go back to the sort of creation story, as it were, of CNN. I think it's interesting, before we go just there, just an observation, in some ways, Ted Turner was this incredible disruptor, and now everyone's talking about disruption of the modern media industry. So in a sense, the story continues. But let's go back, Lisa, to the beginning of time, as it were. When you look back on CNN's creation, which was this crazy, almost chaotic launch, if you will, but Ted had a vision behind it. Tell us, looking back, what you think maybe people don't understand about that moment that is still with you today as someone who reported it.
Ted didn't have a vision for where we are today. It didn't even occur to him that we would get to this stage of things. He was in the moment, and he was, as any great entrepreneur, and he is definitely one of the great entrepreneurs of the 20th century, he was in the moment and seizing what was going on around him. He couldn't have imagined. He wasn't arrogant enough, and he was certainly very confident. He could never have imagined the environment that we're in today. What he was doing when he was starting CNN was seizing the moment of technology. He bought a television station, and it was a UHF station that had been left for dead, that the people who owned it didn't want anymore. And it was only because he had this petri dish, and that this was a moment in time that the media saturation was nothing like it is today. But media was we were all becoming inculcated with media. And that's why Ted created what he created. It wasn't a grand vision at all. Ted had this little crappy station. It was not a network affiliate, and he needed to figure out what to put on it. And he also saw that people were interested in seeing beyond what the three networks were providing, which was television that ended at midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning. He saw that television should be on 24/7 because it was beginning to be it's always been a 24/7 world. I had a grandmother who worked as a secretary in the Brooklyn Navy Yard on the overnight shift in the 50s. But Ted saw that other people worked all hours and wanted to relax and veg out in front of their television at all hours. And that very simple belief or understanding, plus he wanted to sell ad time at all hours, So those two things are what made that market for him. And it just, as I keep saying, snowballed from there. When he started CNN, by the time he started CNN, roughly about 10 years after he first bought this television station, he was really interested in figuring out how to use this next graduation, which was the marriage of the cable and the satellite. And I won't get into all that wonkiness here, but that wonkiness is what made it all possible because he was able to take this crappy station in Atlanta and broadcast it or cable cast it in a region and then around the country. And from there, he was dazzled by the ideas, the possibilities of creating a fourth network. He wasn't the first person who wanted to create a fourth network, but he was dazzled by the possibility of busting the triopoly of the networks who had run the show, so to speak, of television by and large, not only, but by and large since the inception of television. And so it was because he had this technology that he was able to dream. He also had the gumption. He had money, but he didn't necessarily have lots of money and not enough money in a corporate sense to compete with the corporatoids. But that's what launched him. Everyone wants to believe that CNN was a political play. Basically, Ted himself said he didn't even watch the news. He didn't like Walter Cronkite. He leaned right and not left. He thought that Walter Cronkite, like many people did, including my father, felt that Walter Cronkite was telling him how to think. He wasn't interested in the news. He was interested in creating something new. He's a true visionary, but it wasn't about journalism and it wasn't about propagating some sort of agenda.
It is interesting, as you say, Ted was not a journalist himself and did not come into this with a sort of vision for journalism per se. And as you mentioned, more of a technology play and a business opportunity that he saw. I guess the question, though, well, two questions. The first is somewhere there was in Ted a measure of, let's call it a little bit of idealism about what a global news network could mean for the world. I mean, beyond the dollars and cents, right? I mean, he did, even though he wasn't a journalist, he wanted CNN to be the purveyor of news around the world, which was pretty revolutionary.
But that happened after CNN started. It was only once CNN launched that he saw the power, just like he saw the power of television when he put infomercials on in the middle of the night. When he first started doing ads in the middle of the night, what we would call infomercials, people were writing in, and he was blown away by the response of people to ads for various products. Again, this is at a moment in time when you couldn't just dial up anything you want and have it delivered. Similarly, when CNN started, and he only chose news because the other things were taken. HBO was doing movies, ESPN was doing sports. He and his team of men wanted to figure out something to use this marriage of cable and satellite. And that's what, that was what wasn't done yet. Only after it was on for a while. And Mike Betcher, one of the early reporters of CNN, actually, he was the only national reporter, I think, in the earliest days of CNN, went to Cuba and was given a letter by Fidel Castro's people to bring back to the boss in Atlanta. And it basically said, I'm pirating this signal. He didn't quite use the words pirating, but I'm seeing CNN down here in Cuba, and I'm mesmerized by this. Just as we all were mesmerized in the very earliest days of the internet. There's Fidel Castro mesmerized by this whole concept of 24-hour news, it happened to be. And Ted, who had, as I say, was a right-wing leaning person at the time, accepted this commie dictator, as he called him, and went down to Cuba and was intrigued by the fact that this commie dictator was asking him for an audience. And that's when he saw the power. In fact, I found a quote of Ted's, he was saying why CNN became a global force. He said, we sold it to anybody who'd pay, and that's what the cable operators did. I mean, anybody who had 30 bucks a month could get cable, and half the world was communist. So we went out and sold it to the communists. We sold it to the capitalists. We didn't care what color they were, what gender, just as long as they paid on time. So in those earliest days, he didn't have this vision. And then as in the earliest days when I was there as a kid, basically a young person, I remember him talking about the vision for peace. And yes, maybe this tool can unite the world and change the world, but it wasn't his primary motivation.
CNN barely made it in the beginning, right?
Mhm.
This merry band of folks, very small group of folks from a variety of backgrounds. Give us some sense of the vibe back in those startup days when they were still stringing up the lights hours before the thing went on the air and how bad it all was.
Well, it was, again, to set the stage, and none of us can remember this very well, or most of us can't remember it very well. At that moment in time, there were three networks with a half-hour newscast on the network each night. And local news was becoming a force, but it wasn't as pervasive as it is or became. Now it's on its way out in many ways. So they had to hire people. Where did they hire people? Where could CNN find people to come work in Atlanta? Again, not a global presence then, for very little money because CNN didn't have money, it wasn't paying union wages. So basically, what they did was they got a bunch of cast offs. They were people who were brave or crazy enough, or in some cases, couples, because couples were not allowed to work together in most newsrooms or most businesses. Remember, this is the late 70s, early 80s, when the world was very different for women, too. People of color, everything was different. So people who were willing to come to Atlanta, and then the people who really engined the place, because there needed to be a lot of them because it was 24/7, were young people who were willing to work for $3.30 an hour, minimum wage, and willing to pack up the car after college or maybe midway through college and come on down. So it had this let's put on a show kind of sensibility to it, the way any good startup would, and the way any group of people who were committed to, many people weren't committed to some greater vision, but they were just excited to be starting their careers in this place or reviving their careers in this place. Plus, they had a sense of how exciting it was that this was going to be the first all news cable network. So that is so completely different for anybody who's worked at a startup versus working at an established stentorian, keeping up the brand sort of place, whether it was CBS or, Ford or fill in the blank big company. So yeah, so in the very earliest days, it was very scrappy.
How close did he come to running out of money?
Apparently, he came close several times to not making payroll. The complexity of the finances is something that, because it wasn't a public company, aren't really well known, but it is well known that in the earliest days, well, even before CNN launched, it almost didn't make it because he went missing in a yacht race and the satellite went missing up in the sky. And a deal almost fell through to sell another UHF station that he needed to finance everything. And really, when you go back to your original question about where we are today, what happened was for Ted in 1985, 5 years after CNN started, he sold himself, and it was just him. It was Turner. It was the Turner Company. He needed more money to pay for his grand ambition of buying MGM, and he attempted to buy CBS, and he got ahead of himself, and he sold a big piece of himself to a cable consortium.
That I do want to talk though. Still, you mentioned all the stuff about the early days and the kind of let's get some costumes and put on a show
Mhm.
sensibilities. And yet there were moments during the 90s where CNN really did shine and sort of get in the larger consciousness, the attempt on Ronald Reagan's life, the Challenger explosion, to name a couple, and then later at the end of the decade, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then the first Gulf War sort of put CNN on the map. I guess the question out of this is, in your mind, what one of those events, particularly like a moment in time when people said, "Oh my God, CNN," as opposed to just the fanatics who are watching in the middle of the night?
Again, the answer is not an easy one, and it doesn't make for great TV. It's not the real answer to that question is you have to remember that when CNN launched on June 1st, 1980, there were only a million or so homes in the country that could receive it. A million or so homes. So over the course of the 1980s, as cable grew, again, it's the same thing that we've witnessed with the internet. In the early days, you were like, what's a text? And now we live on text, right? In the early days, you were like, what's HTTP:// Nobody knew what that was. But then, of course, incrementally, it snowballed and everyone knew what it was and our lives depended on it. It was the same thing in the 80s with cable. So those things you just mentioned, Reagan assassination attempt in 1981, really set the stage for the other networks to take notice of this thing that they disparaged. They didn't even really, disparaging would be probably too great a word because really nobody cared about CNN at that point. It was just this sort of thing. But with each news event, with each major news event that you've just described, over those first 10 years of CNN's existence, not only did the other broadcast journalists take note, but the audience took note because there was more of an audience to take note. Again, in the earliest days, people didn't understand. And that's what's so hard for people to grasp today. Even if you were alive at that moment, there was a time where we didn't expect to know everything immediately. As that was happening, as that indoctrination was occurring, and more homes were tied into the cable network, and more people were clicking through and looking for something else to watch because now there were more than 3 or 4 or 5 things for them to watch. That happened to be the shuttle Challenger exploding, Tiananmen Square exploding, the Gulf War exploding. And that trained people to watch television news. I mean, the other interesting thing is that even DC didn't have this zeitgeist of press conferences for every godforsaken everything because there was no need for it. I mean, there might be a need for it in a very, very specific way, but there weren't cameras everywhere trained on every single person with people with gleaming fake white teeth talking to you about everything that's going on because that wasn't that sensibility just was not was was created basically by the existence of 24/7 universe.
Which kind of takes us to the point of our series, right? The notion of this birth of chaos media and how incentive structures started to change. If you use Capitol Hill as an example, like I'm going to throw a press conference about almost nothing and be very provocative in my news conference because that's the way I get on cable TV. So the question I think we have is from your research, when did you first see the pressures of 24-hour news beginning to bend CNN away from maybe the original, it's all about the news, it's not about the stars thing, where ratings became hugely important. And the way we get to ratings is by doing a lot of maybe not super newsy things.
2 instances. One is when Ted needed to bring in the outside investors and sold a piece of himself to the outside investors, and other people started looking at the bottom line. But the real answer to that question is 1996. 1996 is when MSNBC, now MS Now, and Fox started. MSNBC started a little bit before Fox, but it was in the same year. And that is when everything changed. As soon as there was corporate competition, that's what changed everything for CNN. That's what changes everything for every business. And that's when I remember in the earliest days of CNN, you would turn it on and it wasn't that people weren't good looking, but they weren't about being good looking. But as soon as there was competition, everything got sexier. That's also when everything got crazier because of the choices that Murdoch and company made about Fox. The other problem is that, as you know well, news gathering is expensive, extremely expensive. And news gathering in the sense of actually going out and reporting stories, even if you're just a one-person band, researching something is expensive. And the minute you add a camera and a sound person, it's completely ridiculously expensive. And CNN and none of them could afford to do enough real journalism. And that's when you started having the talking head fest. That is what cable has become.
It sounds like really on two fronts. One with Fox and MSNBC being more opinion driven, and therefore spicy, if you will, push CNN maybe in the direction of, oh, do we want to drive between those two, and what does that mean? And the second thing is what you were just referencing is, sort of having to keep up with the Joneses in terms of your live coverage all day, every day.
Well, and if you go back and look at the presidents of CNN and the choices they had to make for a long time, they were trying to toe the line of what CNN was originally, which was old guard news, what we would consider good old news. And meanwhile, you're doing good old news. Again, it's like the hamburgers. You're doing good old hamburgers, and then somebody comes along and has, scantily clad waitresses serving up those hamburgers. And your hamburgers might taste better, and they're probably better for you, but scantily clad people are way more compelling and shiny and, all that. And that's really what happened for years. CNN struggled with keeping its focus on what its original focus was, which, by the way, is what all news focus was at that point, broadcast and otherwise. But out here, you've got people going a little wild, a lot wild, and they're saying one thing and doing another, or saying one thing and meaning another. And then all of a sudden you're like, I gotta do something. And then you have somebody like Zucker who came in and said, we gotta meet these guys at their level. And that's when things really started deteriorating.
Well,
It's kind of
I think also, just to pick up one last thing on this before we turn the corner, you point out something really smart, which is what to do on a slow news day, right? I mean, the reality is when there is a hurricane or a war or a huge wildfire and you can just send a reporter to the scene doing live shots, that's terrific, because that people want to hear the up to the date stuff. But on a slow news day, having pundits in boxes opining about the news really is where we have ended up. It started, as you said, back in the 90s. It really started even earlier. I guess Crossfire was created on CNN back in the 80s, but it bloomed in the 90s, and now we're sort of seeing the fruits of that just multiply.
It actually started from day one. They worried when CNN was started, what are we going to do when there isn't something happening? And especially at that moment in time, because everybody on the planet wasn't trained to have a press conference. So literally, there were people in the background who said, how are we going to fill the time 24/7? It's not like there were endless resources then. And someone joked and said, are we going to have to set a house on fire in order to fill the time? And they were kidding. But basically, to me, what you see now is the equivalent of setting a house on fire. We're screaming at each other, and that's more interesting than just the repeat of the headlines. And basically, that in the earliest days, Reese Schoenfeld, who was the creator really of CNN, hired a group of commentators, what, in a newspaper equivalent would be the op-ed columnists. And he had them tape what, again, would be the equivalent of an op-ed column, except they were talking to a camera. And they were luminaries in their particular areas, their fields. And he had these things on the shelf back when things were videotape on a shelf. And that was there to fill in the blanks when, and the other thing is that in the earliest days of CNN, it wasn't just filling in the blanks with those 3-minute commentaries or whatever they were. There were shows that repeated, and there might have been headlines at the top that filled in the blank. So they've struggled. Anybody would struggle with filling the time. And it's just accelerated the minute there were more channels. That's a lot of time to fill and a lot of experts out there. And then you add the avalanche of social media where everybody's an expert. There's no mediation. At least before, a booker had to call me up and put me on the air. Now we're all experts, right here, the tool that's killed us all. It starts to make a little bit more sense.
I'm going to ask you to close your question here real quick, Lisa. If you were to talk, and I bet you do, to journalism students, what story, object lesson from CNN story would you say is something that's important for them to know? What inspiration can they take from CNN, if any?
Well, if you look at what happened in 1981, when Bernard Shaw refused to do what the other networks did, which was announce, or one other network did, which was announce that the president was dead after being shot because they were afraid about missing the story. And Bernard Shaw, the star anchor at CNN in the earliest days, was sticking to the belief, the maxim that you must have two sources and they must be credible sources. If everybody looked at that, and again, this Reiner murder, double murder, it's a terrible tragedy. But if you looked at how that got covered by great journalists at the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and you looked at how other people ambulance chased, you'd see standards that are hard to find these days, that are in short supply. So if journalists, young journalists wanted me to talk to them, unfortunately, I don't get a lot of people who are interested in the story, the history. That's what I would say. Look at the old-fashioned values and maxims, but the problem is you might not have a job in this world if you did. So
Question to pick up on that, if it's okay, John. It's just so that's the sort of value side of journalism and what to aspiring journalists. But you talked a lot about media literacy and the toxicity of how that is undermining it, I guess. But looking at it more as a business, what's your most hopeful case? Because we all despair about, oh, journalism, the business model's broken, local news is going under. But you have taken the long view of history in your books. Is there anything that gives you hope that maybe there'll be a reaction against, meaning the new disruption might disrupt this current atomization and somehow bring us back to a world where we're not so fragmented? Or is that a hopeless notion?
there is no black and white here. It's fantastic that we can have this conversation, that you can record it, that I can take pictures, that I can express my opinion on Substack, that the disintermediation occurred. I could start a podcast tomorrow and I might become whoever, influential. If nothing else, I can get my voice out there. That's great. That's terrific. But what isn't terrific, and that's what CNN was great for. CNN disrupted the old guard media and shook things up. Now we're living with the consequences of it. And we're a black and white world, and there's a lot of gray. And I don't see the way back, because I am really worried about people's mental states, their capacity to engage and to learn about the world around them. So yeah.
Yeah, I think we're struggling as well to see what's around the corner, right? And we hope to explore some of that in this series. Look, the book is called Up All Night, Ted Turner, CNN, and the Birth of 24-Hour News. Lisa, I think the book is still available if you want to read it, right? I know I did.
Well, I'll read it to you. I did the audio version. So if you read like most people do, or many people, not most.
It'll be episode 2 of this series. Lisa reads the book.
Well, thank you, Lisa, for your time today. We really appreciate it, as well as your guidance as we start to build out this series, this podcast series. Have a great rest of your day and have a great holiday for both of you. And we'll see you after the break.